Dobar dan i dobrodošli na 5. predavanje serije predavanja Jugoslavija unutar svetskog sistema, teorije zavisnosti i nejednakog razvoja. Danas je sa nama koleginica Ana Podvršič i ona će držati predavanje pod naslovom Jugoslavije pod vašingtonskim konsenzusom, od dužničke krize do raspada zemlje. Evo, pre nego što dam Ani reč, par podataka o njoj. Dakle, Ana je završila studije francuskog jezika i sociologije kulturu na Univerzitetu u Ljubljani. Zatim je magistrirala studije razvoja na školi visokih studija društvenih nauka u Parizu, da bi doktorirala sociologiju i ekonomske studije zajedno, dakle, na Univerzitetu u Ljubljani i Univerzitetu Paris 13. Trenutno je dobila postdoktorsku stipendiju Marija Kiri i trenutno predaje na Univerzitetu u Gracu. Ona se bavi pitanjima, praktično kojima je ovaj kurs, ova serija predavanja posvećena, dakle, pitanjima neravnomernog razvoja, postsocijalističkih promena i evropskih integracija sa posebnim, dakle, naglaskom na razvoju perifernog kapitalizma i Sloveniji, ulozi dužničke krize o raspadu Jugoslavije. O tome će govoriti upravo danas. I evo da iskoristimo priliku da prikažemo njenu knjigu, to da inše poglavlje iz njene knjige, koja je upravo izašla, dakle, u Ljubljani od izdavača CF. Zove se Socijalizma u periferni kapitalizam, neoliberalizacija Slovenije. Tako da, evo, možete pogledati, ja sam je dobio na poklon, tako da. Evo, izvoli, Ana.
Ja, zdravo. Meni je baš žao, a moj srpsko-hrvatski nije dovoljno dobar da bi sad pričala, tako da idemo po engleskom.
Da, Ana će inače predavati na engleskom jeziku, ali kasnije kad budemo imali diskusiju možete komentare i pitanja davati na srpsko-hrvatskom jeziku, kako se to danas kaže, na zajedničkom jeziku, tako da to imajte u vidu.
Da, super, hvala. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. As already mentioned, I'm going to present the Yugoslav crisis 1980s, especially from the point of view of the debt repayment policies and the so-called the Washington consensus. One of the reasons for this research, why I started to look at the Yugoslavia from the point of view of debt management, was that when you look at on the books of the Yugoslav state disintegration, I mean, you can fill a whole libraries with them, right? But very little or practically there is none that would contextualize Yugoslavia within the global debt crisis or the crisis of post-war for this capitalism, if you want. And this is exactly what I said. It might be an interesting perspective to take on. How to look on Yugoslavia as one of the debtors countries back then that was kind of put under the conditions of the IMF and international creditors, and how this impacted actually local economic and political dynamics. So today we will hear a lot about economic disintegration, economic tendencies, and how they might actually provide some kind of background to the political dynamics that came out. So my starting point to understand Yugoslavia is actually Rosa Luxemburg, yeah, and her idea of capitalist development is a dual process. Yeah, on the one hand, a process of economic surplus value production, but also capitalism as it is alone could not survive just through economic means, through economic constraints, but it always needs some kind of extra economic constraints or measures, or what she said, extra economic appropriation of non-capitalist social formations based on state institutional violence and colonialist and imperialist practices. Yeah, Rosa Luxemburg was interested in the expansion of imperialist powers in late 19th century, early 20th century. And she detected back then the crucial role that international loans and credit systems played, yeah. And for her, the loans were both, as I wrote, a mechanism for exploiting masses, so as a kind of class policies, but at the same time also policies for subordinating peripheral countries to the core colonial powers, yeah, so kind of imperialist mechanism as well. And I think if you think about the foreign debt building in Yugoslavia and the related debt crisis management in the 80s through this perspective of a double function of international loan system, I think it's very productive. And if Rosa Luxemburg was interested in the late 19th, early 20th century, well, for our analysis, 1970s, 1980s are much more relevant, yeah. And I took here the concept of Alain Lippietz, of some French regulationist who was initially Marxist, but then turned very liberal yeah. And he called this 1970s, yeah, what is known in a very descriptive way as petro-recycling process, yeah. He called it private international debt economy, that I think should be seen as some kind of financial fix to the structural capitalism, to the structural crisis of capitalism that started in the late 60s, yeah. And what happened back then is that the core countries started to liberalize banking activities, international loan system, exactly to provide some kind of market outlets, yeah, to their financial capital. Market outlets in the back then peripheral countries, yeah, the so-called developing countries, who actually took this as an opportunity to kind of attenuate their own crisis and problems at home, yeah, in Yugoslavia as part of them. So if the debt building process within this private international debt economy could be seen as a mechanism that tied peripheral countries, including Yugoslavia, to the capitalist core, where the crisis then took place in the 1980s was, on the one hand, a kind of a manifestation or the transfer of this structural crisis from the core to the periphery. But at the same time, through the Washington consensus policies, that I will talk more about them later, and the policy adjustment processes, you could also see it as the first manifestation of neoliberalism, yeah. Both the motivation for refinancing these countries, as well as the policies that were imposed on them, were actually part of the broader neoliberal class and imperialist agenda, yeah. But now, before we go further into Washington consensus and what this exactly meant for Yugoslavia, let's have a look on how Yugoslavia came to be, yeah, again, part of this peripheral part of the capitalist core, and how it participated in this international private debt economy. As far as I'm concerned, I think this should be seen as a kind of consequence of the pro-market, pro-decentralization turn that took in the mid-60s, when the political bureaucracy kind of aligned with the interest of economic bureaucracy and of the representatives of richer political bureaucracy of richer republics, who were both, so economic bureaucracy and political bureaucracy was both aligned to was both already kind of had interest in further integration with capitalist economies. And very briefly, what were the main consequences on the reform level? So as I said, market-oriented reforms with greater integration in the capitalist markets. The state, the republics, the federal units were granted quasi-state autonomy. Very crucial is that any central planning mechanisms were abandoned, as well as any kind of idea of building socialist developmentalist state, yeah. So you could see the retreat of common industrialization strategy and kind of supervision and coordinating redistributive mechanisms, yeah. This is very important to understand the consequences of this turn on the internal level and so of the state of the Yugoslav economy at the start of the crisis. Basically, as a consequence of the changes implemented since mid-60s, the internal structures of Yugoslav economy started to follow kind of polarizing and disintegrating logic, yeah, or disintegrating or disarticulating logic. talking that Yugoslavia was unevenly developed is for me not enough. I think we should talk about structurally heterogeneous development, where you had the clear structural cleavages, between the Northwest, who was industrialized based on labor-intensive industries, integrated also within the capitalist markets, and let's say, it's very simplistic this, but just to give you an idea, and let's say southern regions, which had huge labor surpluses, which was mainly industrializing capital-intensive industries, and who were mostly dependent on Yugoslav market or markets in other socialist countries, So these are very important structural differences, Another very important impact is also on the political level. The back then party system, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, kind of the background of these deep polarizing development tendencies, and together with the decentralization of the state, the party system, the political system changed the logic and started to function like, as I said, multi-republic one-party system. We cannot talk about multi-party system. I think Jovic used this expression because it was still one party, but within this one party you had very different factions that actually kind of resonated with local dominant interests. And finally, in contrast to the local disintegration, if you want, or disarticulation of the Yugoslav economy, went together with the increasing external dependencies. This is actually related because of the disarticulation and having absolutely no coherent industrialization strategy and coordinating industrialization strategies. Yugoslavia became externally dependent on external imports. More it became integrated to capitalist markets, more it became dependent on the imports of technology, and it did not actually provide sufficient means to pay for it. So that means that it could pay for imports only by starting to borrow foreign money. And in the 1970s, the structure of foreign debt changed increasingly in favor of private US dollars dominated credits, which were towards the late 70s, so just before the outbreak of the debt crisis, became strongly based on short-term based credits. So it was Yugoslavia was highly exposed to the crisis. Here I provide you some, just to have an idea about the foreign debt of Yugoslavia. So it's in millions of US dollars. And I would like to draw your attention to two things. So one, if we see just the volume, so the general dynamics, as you can see in the 70s, how it literally exploded, in this period of international private debt economy. And then in the 80s, well, the total volume changes, but not so significantly, And as we will see now, this is partially related to the debt repayment policies and agenda, because since early 80s, Yugoslavia was kind of trapped into the kind of debt circle where you borrow to repay the previous loans. So you borrow to be able to borrow again. So that's one thing, this debt trap circle. And the other thing, if you can see, so you have also the structure of the foreign debt here, so with these different colors. And what I found interesting, at least, is that after 82, the so-called public debt, which means state debt, started to increase relatively compared to the private debt. Well, this was partially also related to the dominant economic policies, as we will see now, because international creditors forced Yugoslav state to take over the debts, basically to socialize the debts. And we will see now that this was one of the crucial, one of the important factor in enforcing political tensions, and cleavages. So how were the Yugoslavia negotiations under the Washington consensus policies? So since early 80s, more particularly in 82, when the then Milka Planin's government declared moratorium on debt financing, Yugoslavia was kind of obliged to resort to IMF and to negotiate with international creditors. about the refinancing and restructuring of foreign debt. The representatives of international finance were kind of put together in a very strong body called 5 Lakh Animal, which was composed of IMF, World Bank, Bank for International Settlement, a manufacturer, Hanover Trust Company, who was American company and who was largely involved into the credits, private debts in Latin America and also elsewhere on the global south, if you want. And it was kind of accredited to negotiate in the name of private banks. And there was also Paris Club, so I mean the alliance of Western governments plus Japanese government together, yeah. So they all negotiated. They negotiated as one common, united body who all act in the name of the international finance. But they decided that they will negotiate with indebted countries like Yugoslavia on individual basis, yeah. So the indebted countries, were prevented to unite themselves. And this was a very important power strategy, right? Because imagine, so Yugoslavia was far from being the only one to be indebted countries back then. It referred to the global South debt crisis, referred also to comprised Latin American countries, also some countries from North Africa, and also some other socialist countries like Poland. And if these countries would unite and act together, yeah, and declared a common moratorium where the power relations would massively change between creditors and debtors, right? But they were prevented to do this, so they could engage in negotiations only on individual basis. And what were basically the aim of creditors on a very, let's say, first-hand basis, short-term basis? One was to just keep countries afloat, so to prevent their really bankruptcies, in order that they would be still able to repay debts partially, yeah? So actually that they would keep sucking money from them. It's basically this very classical imperialist strategy. And also they kind of took the crisis as an opportunity to advance class and imperialist policies through, which kind of were framed within what is known today as Washington consensus. So Washington consensus refers to this whole package of policies that were mainly in favor of liberalization, deregulation, restrictive fiscal and monetary policies, and export reorientation. Yeah, so basically it was policies that favored collapsing of domestic markets, so reducing of domestic markets, to reestablish, as I wrote, neo-colonial dominance. How? Yeah, by bringing the indebted countries back under the dominance of core capitalist countries, taking them as an opportunity, like taking them as eventual suppliers of cheap products or medium products, and a new market outlets for their investments. It was Washington consensus had this general kind of, there was Washington consensus in general, as I said, and then for socialist countries, the package partially changed as the organization of socialist economies was different from those from, let's say, Latin America. So besides this standard package of restrictive monetary and fiscal policies, increase of interest rates, price regulation, collapsing wages and austerity measures, you had in addition the implementation or the introduction of convertible currency, and implicitly also the disintegration of the Comecon, of this socialist trading bloc that existed. So all this had kind of quite powerful imperialist dimension, if you ask me. Yugoslavia was among indebting countries of the 1980s a special case for several reasons. When it came to Yugoslavia, the international creditors and especially the banks, the banks had a double agenda. So one was, as elsewhere, this one-size-fits-all neoliberal policies of austerity, liberalization, and export reorientation. So, but in addition, they asked for the state political change. In 1982, when Planin's, back then Milka Planin's federal government needed to renegotiate foreign debt, the international bank said that they will participate and provide no loans only on the basis if the state would centralize the control of money and foreign currency. This was a mega anti-constitutional demand. so the demand was not anti-constitutional, but the change that took place was anti-constitutional, so it went against the established decentralization of the state and the autonomy, the quasi-autonomy of the leaders of federal units, over the money flows. And besides the greater control of federal authorities over money and credits, also the National Bank stood over the control over the foreign currencies. In 1983, two laws was implemented following the requests of international creditors. One was small foreign currency law, saying that the repayment of annuities has priority over the other payments abroad, and the so-called circles of solidarity, which I really find full of cynicism, was the law saying that all units should kind of take the responsibility for the repayment of debt. So meaning that the units within the enterprise should solidarize and take over the burden of the debt repayment. The republics should take over the burden of the debt repayment. So, I mean, the idea, it's not bad as such, right? It's solidarity over the crisis adjustments and the cost of the crisis. But in Yugoslavia, this created really big political tensions. And in addition, it was really anti-constitutional. The next special case for Yugoslavia was that kind of the IMF did not need to come to Yugoslavia to provide its agenda of restrictive policies and austerity measures. In 81, the back then federal government established its own commission called Krieger Commission, which was kind of a commission for reforms composed of young liberal economists, directors from large export-oriented enterprises, but also some representatives of political bureaucracy. What they, in 82 or 83, they proposed a kind of a program of economic restructuring, so evaluation of the crisis and their solutions. So it was long-term program of economic stabilization, and the solution that they kind of proposed was rationalization of decentralization. Basically, that meant that the common causes of the crisis were kind of prescribed to the still too much of political intervention in the economy, not enough of integration in the capitalist economies, but also kind of too much of discoordination. So they also went kind of towards this idea that Yugoslavian market needs to be more united and more centralized, and they would kind of do this with greater market measures, more centralized management, and obvious austerity measures. And these ideas more or less were in line with the IMF as well. So I think Yugoslavia was the only one who produced its own document for the negotiations with the IMF that was kind of took seriously. So basically, this program of austerity measures, liberalization, did not at all resolve the crisis, the causes of the crisis as such. Instead, it mainly prolonged it. So here you have a graph on the, I'm really sorry, I forgot to add. So this is a graph on the total domestic output growth, so gross social product. These you have annual changes, And what you can see from the trend line is how Yugoslav economy was kind of in a downward trend through the whole decade. The second part of the decade was especially, Yugoslavia experienced really significant economic crisis. Behind the worsening of economic figures, the crisis or the main macroeconomic problems as such change. We could say that the crisis in Yugoslavia started in 1972 as a current account crisis, where the deficit exploded after the two oil shocks. Then it it kind of transferred into the debt crisis in 82, so after the Volcker shock and the rate increase of the interest rates. And ended the decade in this kind of hyperinflation crisis, yeah. So after 87, the already existing inflation really exploded, and Yugoslavia kind of faced a hard hyperinflation situation. The interesting thing is that on a general level, we can talk about the last decade, and many people talk about last decade of the 80s for Yugoslavia, because where the total economic output in 89 was more or less there where it was in 79. So it was a whole stagnation. But you had some very significant structural changes that took place behind, and it was very revealing of this debt as imperialist and class mechanism. So on this graph, you have the average per capita growth of gross social product, yeah, in different decades, and then you have current account surpluses or deficits, yeah. And what you can see is the interesting change that took place in the 80s, yeah. Basically, it was the year where, as we said, economy kind of stagnated, collapsed, yeah. It was actually negative in terms of per capita growth, but Yugoslavia started to accumulate significant current account surpluses, right? Which is quite significant. But that doesn't mean that it became New Germany and that it started to export massively. Actually, this current account surpluses was the kind of external aspects of internal depression and social hardship. Yeah. Actually, one of the constant requests of the international creditors was that so the debt repayment has to have priority over anything else. That's one thing, and the other thing is that Yugoslavia was obliged to constantly accumulate foreign currency reserves that should be reoriented to debt repayment. So basically what this shows is actually how Yugoslavia was forced to accumulate surpluses that it managed to accumulate, but that it cannot use for the economic or social restructuring at home, right? And actually, since the beginning of the 80s, there was actually already the outflows of capital from Yugoslavia to the core capitalist countries on the basis of the repayment of debt, right? And as I said, this strange external stabilization came at the cost of the internal collapse. So again, some figures just to give you an idea. So you have the figures for the annual changes of consumption, so different sorts of consumption. And so that's really just to give you the idea of the impact of the hard crisis, right? Because what you can see here is that the first part of the 80s, I mean, all figures are negative, yeah. So that's a sign. So consumption went from worse to worse. Investments collapsed totally, yeah. Again, as I said, that's just a sign of a very significant economic crisis that Yugoslavia was facing. And the interesting thing is that actually it started already before the formal debt negotiations. Yeah, so immediately when the Đuranović government in the late 70s was forced with the current account crisis, they implemented very harsh austerity measures. Yeah, and that they continued once the international creditors came in. How did people react and workers react to the harshening of social conditions, yeah, under harsh neoliberal policies, where they did react significantly? Here you have a figure on the rising striking workers. Yeah, you can see from the beginning of the decade where you had about 11,000 workers on the street. Towards the end of the decade, you had about 400,000 striking workers. These are official numbers, yeah. In addition to this, you had also other forms of protest. The point of this is just to show you that there was immense popular unrest and contestation against the Washington consensus policies. In this graph, I also tried to mark some important turning points. So the first increase in 82, the first increase of workers' movement followed the implementation of the long-term stabilization program, yeah. And as you see, it started to really to increase after 84, when Planin's government implemented first more serious market-oriented measures that sent some of the enterprises to bankrupt. And then the workers' movement literally exploded between 86 and 87, and this was mostly related to the intervention laws, and later in 80 to the so-called May measures. So May measures were the policies of the Mikulic government, and we could see them as kind of the first harsh mini shock therapy for Yugoslavia, yeah? So where the measures were anchored. The measures were anchored, and they were much more radical from the austerity measures and liberalizations that took place before. Despite such a significant protest that took place in the 80s in Yugoslavia and really sent Yugoslavia Yugoslavia took a place on itself when it came to the labor unrest in the 80s, right? Nevertheless, I mean, neither market measures, neither the restoration of capitalism was blocked, as we all know. Actually, if you ask me, one of the important things how to think about the crisis in 80s is to understand that it was very asymmetrical, right? So all the numbers that I showed before you were on average, but we should think about the very different asymmetrical impacts that the crisis had on Yugoslavia, given the fact that it was structurally heterogeneously developed, right? So the crisis itself and the dominant measures only made the previous inequalities to explode. By the end of the decade, so by 1980s, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina already declared bankruptcies, yeah, official bankruptcies, while Slovenia, it was already kind of enjoyed practically full employment, right? So here you have a graph on the official unemployment rate in the same year, and as you can see, the differences are like astonished. One of the reasons for this explosion of the differences, of the asymmetries, is that actually the Washington consensus agenda impacted regions very unevenly, as it has kind of sectorial bias, yeah. So as giving its strong export orientation, it favored those that were connected to the capitalist market, so that were already connected to the kind of networks of Western multinational corporations. And given the emphasis on debt repayment, they also kind of privileged those that had access to foreign currencies, yeah, via exports or via tourism, Croatia, for instance, and so on, yeah. So you had asymmetrical impacts related to this, and at the same time, and how they translated is, besides the uneven and asymmetrical development of the crisis internally, if you look on the international integration of Yugoslavia in the 1980s, well, you have kind of Slovenia, who progressively disintegrated from Yugoslavia on economic level, because it became much more integrated into the Western capitalist markets, yeah. Actually, by the end of decades, I think Slovenia imported and exported for about 30%, a little bit less, 30% of all exports and imports of Yugoslavia from capitalist markets and from socialist markets, which is significant. While all other markets, so let's say I put here the so-called socialist markets, so the Yugoslav markets and the other awesome markets of socialist countries were in a huge crisis, yeah, meaning that the producers could not really take advantage of them, yeah. And basically what happened in the 1980s on the level of Yugoslav economy was that, if we can talk that until then, this was some kind of integration of uneven partners, yeah, given the level of regional inequalities. Well, I think in the 1980s, this kind of relationship took another twist, and you had a very clear asymmetries between creditors and debtors. Yeah, and if you ask me, like in thinking about these asymmetries and giving strong pressures from below that came from labor movement, yeah, this can both partially explain you how the economic crisis moved to the political crisis and then to the state disintegration. So what I will try to explain you now is how I kind of map the disintegration process, yeah, because again, many studies try to ask why Yugoslavia disintegrated, and I think that's a very complex question, and I try to reverse it by asking how the process as such took place, just to understand the issues that were at play, yeah? And how these debt repayment policies, the economic readjustments and social hardship kind of all contributed to the forging of kind of national bourgeois social blocks on national or on federal units levels, yeah? So I kind of distinguish this disintegration process into the 4 periods, which kind of correspond to the different federal governments in place and to the crisis hardship, if you want. So what took place at the early 80s, so between 1979 and 1982, I would say it was some kind of old style relying on our forces, yeah. So neither the austerity measures and also like market-oriented reforms in Yugoslavia were nothing exceptional, yeah. The Yugoslav authorities often implemented kind of austerity measures and kind of adjustments to reply to the crisis situations already before. But what was different from in the 80s from the periods before is that while before the pro-market measures and austerity went together with the expansion of self-management on micro level. In the 80s, it went against self-management, against the rights of workers to decide about their incomes, and also against the rights of federal units to control the local economies, if you want. But in the early 80s, we still have this old style relying on our forces, so very harsh austerity measures to combat the current account crisis and prevent even further explosion of the debt, where unfortunately the Volcker shock took place in between and kind of went against the Veselin Djuranovic plans, yeah. Also the first IMF standby arrangements was signed back then, but it was still without conditions, yeah. Simply because the IMF changed its policies towards the indebted countries after the Mexico declaration of the debt moratorium in 82. Yeah. So in the early 80s, nothing tremendous on political plan, but then things started to change when the negotiations with international creditors started. So in the period of Milka Planin's, when the government, as already said, declared moratorium and had to negotiate foreign debts, and the state was forced into recentralization and also into the introduction of first pro-market measures. So when I say it was forced, it should be maybe a little bit explained, because market forces, market reforms in Yugoslavia had a solid base, we saw it, right? There's a solid base among economic bureaucracy, but also political leadership. So they did not need foreign actors to be persuaded into market reforms. But what did happen is that this took place in the conditions that did not want, right? And the room for maneuvering was very limited. If the economic crisis at the beginning of 80s did not pose such a problems, where after the state recentralization in the name of international finance, yeah, the political cleavages started to come out, and if you follow the debate back then, you can clearly see kind of north-south divide, right? So who bears the cost of the crisis and controls the foreign currencies, yeah? To who will cover the burden of the crisis? Who should control the main money money power, and there was obviously big desolidarization of the, especially, let's say, richer republics from Slovenia to participate in the joint repayments of debts. Yeah, one of the reasons being that Slovenian economy itself was very dependent on foreign currencies, because it was the only way how it could secure the exports. So, if during the government of Milka Planince, the sign of the political crisis came up, where the political crisis kind of took shape of some kind of more obvious separatism during the government of the Branko Mikolic, so 1860. So Branko Mikolic was on power between 1860 and 1889, but this separatist spiral, I would rather put it between the two very tiny years of 86 and 88. Yeah, so again, new IMF arrangements with much stricter conditionality than before, because IMF started to kind of change the perspective on the crisis. If at the beginning, the crisis in the global south, including Yugoslavia, was considered as being mostly the crisis of current account deficit problems, and it just needs some adjustments with liberalization and austerity measures, where in the second half of the decade, the idea was that these countries need much more robust structural adjustments programs, yeah. Including for Yugoslavia, much harsher price liberalization. And when the first price liberalization measures were implemented, as already mentioned, the Yugoslavia started to face very serious hyperinflation spiral. That was the main preoccupation of Branko Mikolic. The mini shock therapy, yeah, the main measures could not be implemented back then, partially because of the labor unrest, the massive strike movement, but also because League of Communists of Yugoslavia de facto ceased to exist, right? And no common action was actually possible anymore. According to Susan Woodward, there were like two main factions within the communists back then. She talked about trickle-down liberals, I would rather say neoliberals, and Keynesian neoliberals. So one said, we need markets, but we can do this only within the federal state, because we still need some distributive mechanisms. So we can say they were pro-capitalist, or they were pro-market oriented, but they were still aware that any market introduction has a great distributive consequences, and to be able to implement these policies and knowing the social consequences that this might help, they kind of favor state mechanisms for redistribution. Unsurprisingly, Keynesian liberals were also related to those that coming from a lot from those republics that were worse off during the crisis. And on the other hand, you have trickle-down neoliberals who were actually mostly saying that no state mechanisms, no redistribution mechanisms on the federal level actually needs to be implemented along the market-oriented reforms. And these positions actually kind of also reflected the political position when it comes to the reorganization of the state, yeah, following either confederalist line or federalist line. So if until 1988, the leadership of Yugoslavia considered that the crisis could still be managed within this within the system of self-management and social property. Well, once the main measures failed, the leaders decided that this is not anymore the case, and the social property and self-management are the main causes of the crisis, which was obviously not at all true. And the Mikolic established Commission for Systemic Reforms, which soon came up with the idea that what will help to resolve the crisis of Yugoslavia was the abolishment of social property, the restoration of labor and capital markets, and the reduction of the role of workers' council. So basically what they suggested is they had no concrete solutions to the crisis. They just decided that they would prefer to to kind of orchestrate a quite serious class attack of, or what I called in my book, expropriation without accumulation, yeah, dispossession without any accumulation. So this was being without any solution for the crisis, and yeah, mainly following the dominant measures. The only way how they could still secure their control was to actually destroy the system that lost all the legitimacy. In parallel to this, with the change of the system, you had the reinforcement of the kind of reinforcement of the separations within the League of Communists in favor of the building of kind of social blocks on the federal units level, yeah, social blocks with the integration or cooptation of social actors and groups that were outside of the party apparatuses or state apparatuses, yeah. As I mentioned, there was, in the late 80s, Yugoslavia was a scene of faced significant protests from all sides, not just from workers, and the party leaders in different federal units actually kind of co-opted this content with the idea to build kind of local ruling social blocks, yeah. And that means that actually when the Ante Marković came on power in 1989 and proposed the final shock therapy for Yugoslavia as a way to fight inflation, well, Yugoslavia was, I mean, the country de facto did not exist anymore, yeah. There were like two parallel processes going on again. On the systemic level, the leaders of the federal units of the republics started to hastily rewritten local constitutions in order to secure the control over the property change, yeah. When we talk about the abolishment of social property in Yugoslavia and the privatization, where the interesting thing is that this privatization in Yugoslavia took place through the nationalization, yeah. And so this was one process, and the other process was with the Marković government and the IMF shock therapy, which was kind of a very radical anti-inflation program of strict, very restrictive measures, combined with liberalization and also introduction of convertible currency. Yeah, so they kind of prepared a very radical program for kind of neoliberal Yugoslavia, but this program de facto could not be implemented and could not actually see any future, because back then the main strategies of the core actors were already diverging, right? So Yugoslavia, as I said, de facto could not really exist, or existed only on a very asymmetrical basis. And as I wrote you here, so there were like different strategies over the control, regarding the control over the property change and macroeconomic rights, so the control over the macroeconomic tools. If the federal government and IMF kind of fought for federal state, you had Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia kind of pursuing the strategy of building a national bourgeois states, yeah. But even within this group, Slovenia and Croatia were rather on a confederalization ideas for a confederalization idea, while Serbia still defended greater decentralization, but it would kind of favor Serbian majority within. And as I said, as far as I'm concerned, in the 1890 Yugoslavia de facto, I mean, existed only on the paper, and this kind of also became true in the later years, starting on the 14th extraordinary Congress of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, when where the formal disintegration of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia took place, and then yeah, it was followed by the process of formal state disintegration. So let me now conclude. What are my main points? If I can. There is no main points. No, there are some. Okay. So what were my main points in all this? So as I said, I think it's important to contextualize the Yugoslav 1980s period in a broader context. Yeah, historical context, which was kind of shaped by the rise of neoliberalism, the imposition of the Washington consensus policies on indebted countries, and the kind of global South 1980s crisis debt management. But I do not consider that Washington consensus or international creditors would be the reason for the Yugoslav state breakup. I mean, as we see, there were already strong polarizing and disintegrating tendencies already before the crisis. But what the maybe Washington consensus policies did and international creditors was that they reinforced them. They reinforced them partially also because Yugoslavia lost political, in the 1970s, Yugoslavia lost not only, became not only economically dependent, but by becoming economically dependent on foreign creditors, it also lost macroeconomic sovereignty. Yeah. And I think this is an important factor that we should consider when we talk about 1980s crisis, because neither money or finance are, as I said, neutral instrument, but they are kind of crucial tools for exerting political and social control and power. And when we look at from this point of view, we see there was a kind of a double process going on. Yeah. So with the foreign debt building in the 1970s kind of secured the kind of mirage of prosperity of self-management and social property. Yeah. It provided to Yugoslav leaders some kind of a way to postpone the problems that were already much present in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. And at the same time, it was also kind of a tool that subordinated Yugoslavia back to the capitalist core. And both this mirage of prosperity and the subordinations came fully out in the 1980s when the crisis broke up. And what happened under this very restrictive policies of the Washington consensus, where there was on the one hand vertical struggles over the cost of the crisis, so who will pay for the crisis, and about the transfer of the cost of the crisis to the working class and poorer region especially, as we saw. And on the other hand, we can talk about the reinforcement of horizontal crisis, the struggle of the reinforcement of the horizontal struggle, so the struggles between the leaders of the federal units over the control of the crisis process, over the control over the policy instruments and resources, so especially foreign currency. I think the role of the foreign currency is strongly downplayed when it comes to the 1980s crisis in Yugoslavia, and also in general, the role of the struggles, the political struggles over the foreign currencies, which play crucial role for Yugoslavia, first because it was dependent on foreign currencies for its imports, and then for the debt repayments, and because of the capacities of the Slovenian region to earn foreign currency, right? Which in the 1980s proved to be one of the reasons for the separatist tensions in Slovenia. And basically what the Washington consensus did, I think international creditors were very naive when they come to Yugoslavia with this program. They totally underplayed domestic power structures, being between the leaders and working classes or between the leaders themselves. But they did manage to kind of, as I said, sucked out a lot of value from Yugoslavia. So in this sense, they were successful, but they did not manage to keep Yugoslavia together, because the crisis process as such actually only reinforced these tendencies to work on for its own, these separatist, disintegrating tendencies that were already there before under the crisis hardships. This only reinforced. And it partially reinforced simply because of the fact that since the 60s, the debate about regional solidarity was that in Yugoslavia. So this was for me and this is why I wrote at the end, more Yugoslavia integrated into capitalist markets, more internally disintegrated it became, and the final separation and disintegration then took place with, we can call it Slovenian exit. I mean, it was triggered by Slovenian exit, which was nothing else than protectionism of the rich and privileged. So if there was something that kind of, if there was a reason behind the disintegration of Yugoslavia, I think we should look at the political factors, and one being the lack of solidarity. Thank you. I think I'll finish here.
Hvala Ana na sjajnom predavanju. Evo, obično slušamo priče da je Jugoslaviju razorio nacionalizam, a sada vidimo ovako i odakle, dakle, taj nacionalizam, koji su bili, dakle, tih strukturni uslovi njegovog ispoljavanja, i dobra je analiza, mislim, zato što pravi ovu dijalektiku unutrašnjih i spoljašnjih uzroga i lepo ih artikuliše, dakle, te promene u unutrašnjoj ekonomskoj političkoj strukturi sa promenama koje dolaze na globalnom planu. Evo, ja otvaram debatu, tako da izvolite sa komentarima i pitanjima, i oni koji su prisutni ovdje i oni koji su sa nama preko Zooma. Izvolite. Nemaš primjedbi? Pa ne možeš da imaš primjedbi, možda imaš dopunu.
Nije direktno vezano za temu, ali listao sam knjigu, pa vidimo, imaš u zaključku da su sindikati i levica neka vrsta pokušaja alternative. Znam i jedne i druge, i privatno mislim. I u nekoliko, malo, čini mi se dovoljno pratim šta rade jedni i drugi, sindikati i levica. Koliko iz tvoje perspektive, pošto tamo živiš i radiš, koliko to jeste stvarno jako utemeljeno i perspektivno? Levica i sindikati i njihov rad.
Sada u Sloveniji. Aha, okej. Ja.
Možeš nam na engleskom.
Možem. Yeah, so trade unions in Slovenia, yeah, they are considered, and also I consider them as being one of the crucial factors behind progressive neoliberalization of Slovenia after late 80s, yeah, so with the independence and so on. And I think we should see this as a kind of consequence of successes of self-management in Slovenia, yeah. And I wrote also in the conclusion of the book that it is a bitter irony of the history that kind of Slovenia managed transition or this restoration of capitalism and integration on the European single market much better and easier, because by separating from Yugoslavia, it kind of managed to secure what it gained best, what it gained most from Yugoslavia. So being strong trade unions or strong working movement, and quite significant economic base, right? How it secured that? Yeah, it was not obliged to went into any redistributive policies and negotiations on a federal level. Yeah, that it might be so. The trade unions from early 90s in Slovenia compared to today were very different. Yeah, the early 90s trade unions kind of were partially still were empowered, or I said that they followed class strategy, so a strategy that was kind of that considered different workers as being part of a whole, and they were very proactive. They were not inoffensive. They were very defensive, and that exercised huge pressure on Slovenian state leaders in the early 90s regarding privatization process and regarding the salaries. Nowadays, Slovenian trade unions in Slovenia are much different, yeah, for various reasons. One of the reasons being that they slowly their position, their negotiating power strongly weakened, partially because they changed strategy, being exposed to several pressures, and also probably some of the maybe careerism or decisions of the leaderships that progressively started to defend kind of economic syndicalism, so a syndicalism that would mostly favor its own core workers, and that would in a way act against the benefit of the workers as such as a whole group. So if in the early 90s, the trade unions in Slovenia still had the capacities to significantly influence and shape state policies towards towards greater social orientation, and forced the state and also the capitalist group to concede significant concessions to working classes. Well, nowadays they act more as a kind of, how can I say? I cannot say extension of management, but it's not far away from this, and that's so this is for the trade unions. I mean, and what I'm talking now is especially for the trade unions from private sector. And luckily, Slovenia has very strong trade unions also in the public sectors, who actually now kind of overtook this role of being much more radical in their demands than the trade unions from the private sector is. And you ask for Levica as well, right? And Levica, so Levica. Levica is a kind of sad story of quite radical anti-neoliberal enthusiasm to the increasing bourgeois liberal party. Bourgeois liberal party, dominated by quite significant opportunism of the main leaders, I would say. So I'm personally, when you analyze Levica, you could see how it progressively moved by more it was involved into parliamentarism, more it had to actually say no to its radical program, right? I think this was like kind of concession done. I think Levica made a strategic failure, wrong move. It would be smarter to build local base, to maybe act as a municipal party on several corners of Slovenia before going to national politics. I'm not saying that the fact is that they have minor power in the government, they cannot do much, right? And they are forced to compromises. Levica is currently in the government, which is led by a very neoliberal green party, so a party with neoliberal programs and some green market measures. I would think it's time to get out and stand for its program and saying we will not be the party who will participate in the current privatization of public health and so on. So I don't know whether that replies.
Izvolite sa pitanjima, ovde neko ili možda sa Zooma, izvolite slobodno. Dobro, hajde, dok ostali ne dobiju ideju za pitanje, možda ja da postavim jedno. Tiče se ovog raslojavanja. Rekla si da nakon neuspeha majskih mera da polako, dakle, partijska rukovodstva napuštaju ideju da je mere štednje moguće sprovesti unutar samoupravnog okvira. I onda smo videli te različite strategije praktično izlaska iz socijalizma. Sad, moje pitanje je ovako, zašto nije došlo do nekakve veće saradnje između Ante Markovića i Slobodana Miloševića? Jer obojice su u ovo vreme, dakle, imali liberalan plan, obojice su bili za recentralizaciju i obojice su imali podršku i ovih takozvanih međunarodnih institucija i evropske ekonomske zajednice. Zašto tu nije uspelo da dođe do nekakvog savezništva? Već su nekako sva republička rukovodstva, barem ovim najvažnijim republikama, želela da sapnu Ante Markovića, iako su manje više kada su došli na vlast spovodili ili pokušali makar da sprovedu slične mere koje je on predlagao.
So. Yeah, I mean, from how I understand it and how I understood from the analysis that I read, I think they really their programs were. So the important thing is the question of power, right? And Milosevic, as let's say Kučan from Slovenia, they did not want to lose the sources of power, which was the control over the policies, And this is why I think it's really important to highlight they had their own programs of building national bourgeois states, liberal national bourgeois states, which would secure them the mechanisms of power, and this went against what where the IMF plan and the federal government plan would keep exactly these controls, the control over the property change and the macroeconomic tools within the federal government. So the alliance here was not possible because it was exclusionary. At least this is how I see it, because the federalism that was proposed by Markovic and IMF was kind of the federalism of the 50s, where the federal units had very limited power, or let's say the power over the money and finance would be under the federal apparatus.
Okay. Hvala. Čekaj, mikrofon. Mikrofon.
Da dodam još, uslovno i grubo rečeno, Markovićeva politika je bila otprilike frakcija vladajuće koja je u svojoj biti bila industrijska proizvodna, a ovo je bila a Miloševićeva je bila pre svega financijska i trgovačka.
Yeah, that's also maybe something interesting to highlight is so you were now mentioning the Markovic and Milosevic, and we could also what I found interesting was also that Serbia is being much more dependent on Yugoslav markets and not also other socialist markets. Well, it also had in a way partially greater interest to keep these economic relations, exchanges. So with, let's say, socialist markets that were anyway disintegrating, but still. Where again, for the Slovenian leadership, the important thing was to go as fast as possible towards the European markets, right? And this is what I kind of tried to highlight, this economic disarticulation that took place in the 1980s and that reached a new dimensions due to the crisis, and the different crisis impacts. And then this was also related, as you say, to different, we can call it accumulation strategies. But it was kind of a combination of, I would say, power interest, existing economic polarizations, and state structures, that kind of played against unite Yugoslavia, or for this you would need another socialist project. That's for me clear.
Hvala, Ana. Izvolite sa pitanjima. Dobro, u redu. Ako nema više pitanja, izgleda da je predavanje bilo toliko jasno i lepo složeno da ljudi ne nalaze potrebu da išto pitaju. Dakle, bilo je verovatno dobro i didaktično, tako da zahvaljujem Sanji na sjajnom predavanju.
Hvala i tebi.
I družimo se opet 20. juna kada će biti posljednje predavanje u ovom ciklusu. Marko Kržan će održati predavanje o savremenom imperijalizmu. Hvala vam i vidimo se tada, sve najbolje. Hvala na još jedan put.